welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving deep into the history of U.S. foreign interventions from the end of World War II to the present.
Okay.
Our source material is excerpts from William Blum's Killing Hope, U.S. military and CIA interventions since World War II.
Right.
This book details a vast array of covert and overt actions taken by the U.S. government.
Yeah. So
It's going to be a wild ride.
get ready for a wild ride through history.
Yeah, what's fascinating about this period is how quickly the U.S. transitioned from being a wartime ally to almost becoming an adversary of leftist movements on a global scale.
Right.
Bloom's book really highlights this shift.
It really does.
Doesn't it?
And what I found interesting is that the Cold War and this wave of anti-communist sentiment seem to be at the heart of this shift in U.S. foreign policy.
Absolutely.
The fear of communism spreading and the domino theory.
Yeah.
These were powerful driving forces behind U.S. foreign policy for decades.
Yeah.
It's almost hard to grasp the intensity of that fear today.
It is fascinating to think about how this fear, whether justified or not, became the ultimate justification for so many U.S. actions.
Yeah.
Propping up brutal dictatorships or destabilizing democratically elected governments, all in the name of containing communism.
And that's where Blum's work gets really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
He presents evidence suggesting that this communist threat was often exaggerated and sometimes even fabricated to serve political agendas.
Okay, so let's unpack some specific examples.
Okay.
You know, those early interventions in China, Italy, Greece, the Philippines.
Right.
The U.S. was incredibly active in the years immediately following World War II.
Yeah.
Looking back, it's almost unbelievable how quickly the U.S. pivoted from wartime ally to active opponent of leftist movements, even those who had resisted fascism alongside the Allies.
Take the case of Italy in 1948, for instance.
Okay.
The U.S. government, fearing a communist win in the election, engaged in a massive campaign of propaganda.
Wow.
They funneled financial aid to anti-communist parties and even threatened to cut off economic assistance if the left won.
Wow.
It's a stark illustration of how the U.S. was willing to interfere in democratic elections to prevent even the possibility of communist influence.
It's almost mind-boggling how overt those efforts were.
Right.
It wasn't cloak and dagger maneuvering. It was straight-up intervention.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Uh-huh.
The Christian Democratic Party, heavily backed by the U.S., won the election.
But it raises some uncomfortable questions, doesn't it?
It does.
Was it ethical for the U.S. to interfere in another country's democratic process in this way?
Right.
And what were the long-term consequences of such actions?
Then there's the case of Korea.
Okay.
Blum highlights how the U.S. chose to wage a full-scale war rather than pursue a mediated armistice as it had done in other conflicts.
Right.
Was this choice inevitable, or were there missed opportunities for a peaceful resolution?
The key difference in Korea, the presence of a communist side. Right. This war resulted in utter devastation and a divided Korea, a tragic testament to the human cost of this ideological struggle.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what if cooler heads had prevailed? Could the Korean War have been averted, or at least mitigated?
Shifting gears a bit, let's delve into the CIA and its covert operations.
Okay.
Blum details a lot of those activities.
Right.
Regime change, assassination, sabotage, propaganda.
Yeah.
It seems they were incredibly active during this period.
Yeah, the CIA played a crucial role in advancing U.S. interests during the Cold War.
Yeah.
Iran in 1953 is a prime example.
Oh.
The CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iran's oil industry.
Right.
The U.S. viewed this as a threat to its interests and took decisive action.
Yeah.
But was it justified? Was it legal?
Right.
These are questions that still resonate today.
And then there's Guatemala in 1954. The CIA ousted President Arbenz because his land reforms threatened the United Fruit Company, yet again American business interests taking center stage.
These covert actions, while often successful in achieving their immediate objective, frequently had devastating long-term consequences for the countries involved.
Yeah.
Decades of instability, repression, human rights abuses. The ripple effects were enormous.
What I find particularly disturbing is that many of these operations were kept hidden from the American public.
Right.
The CIA essentially operated in the shadows, accountable to no one.
Right.
Congress was misled, the media was manipulated, and a culture of secrecy shielded them from scrutiny.
That lack of transparency raises some fundamental questions about democratic accountability.
Yeah.
Can a nation claim to be a beacon of freedom and democracy while simultaneously operating a vast network of covert operations, often with disastrous consequences?
Blum then turns his attention to Latin America.
Okay.
Where this domino theory really took root.
Right.
The U.S. viewed any leftist movement in Latin America as a direct threat to its national interest, right?
Exactly.
Cuba, after Castro's revolution, became the epicenter of this anxiety.
Right.
But U.S. interventions weren't limited to Cuba.
Yeah.
They extended to the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Chile, and many other countries.
You see a pattern emerging, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This perceived need to intervene, to control events, to prevent the spread of communism at all costs.
Right.
It seems like a recurring theme throughout Blum's book.
Chile is a particularly tragic example.
Okay.
The U.S. actively supported the coup against socialist President Allende,
Right.
pouring millions into opposition parties, spreading propaganda, and even exploring ways to disrupt the economy.
Wow.
This intervention had a profound and lasting impact on Chilean society, leading to years of brutal dictatorship under Pinochet.
It makes you wonder about the unintended consequences of these interventions.
Yeah.
Did the U.S., in its efforts to prevent the spread of communism, actually create the conditions for greater instability, repression, and human suffering in the long run?
That's a question worth pondering,
Yeah.
and it's something we'll continue to explore as we delve deeper into Blum's work.
Let's move on to the latter part of the Cold War and beyond. Cambodia is a particularly striking example of how the U.S. escalated its involvement in Southeast Asia.
Blum details how the U.S. fixated on containing communism, exerted immense pressure on Cambodian leader Prince Sihanouk.
Wow.
They even resorted to covert operations and economic pressure to push him towards the West.
It's almost as if they couldn't fathom a neutral stance.
Right.
A country choosing its own path without aligning with either superpower.
Exactly.
And when those efforts to sway Sihanouk failed, the U.S. backed a coup led by Lon Nol.
Right.
This move ultimately paved the way for the devastating rise of the Khmer Rouge. The irony is almost Shakespearean. The very force they sought to contain ended up gaining power because of their action.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It speaks to the danger of ideological rigidity and the law of unintended consequences in foreign policy.
Then there's Laos.
Okay.
Blum describes how the U.S. actively undermined neutralist Prime Minister Suvarnabhumi Phumma, who sought a path of peace and non-alignment.
Right.
I'm sensing a recurring pattern here.
Yeah.
The U.S., fearing the spread of communism, ends up creating the very conditions that allow it to flourish.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
And that pattern isn't limited to Southeast Asia.
Right.
Blum highlights how the U.S. used a similar playbook in Latin America, with Ecuador being a prime example.
Okay.
The CIA was deeply involved in manipulating Ecuadorian politics.
Wow.
From infiltrating labor unions and spreading disinformation to planting fabricated documents to discredit individuals as communists?
That's right. It's a stark reminder of how the CIA operated during the Cold War, this web of covert actions and propaganda designed to control the narrative and shape events to their liking.
Similar tactics were employed in countries like Brazil, where the U.S. played a crucial role in the overthrow of President Goulart.
Right.
Again, he was labeled as a communist threat despite his moderate policies.
And that, of course, ushered in yet another period of military dictatorship in Brazil, with all the accompanying brutality and repression.
Yeah.
These actions raise some fundamental questions, don't they? Was this fear of communism always grounded in reality?
Yeah.
Or was it often a convenient pretext for pursuing strategic and economic interests?
Those are questions worth considering.
Yeah.
Blum points out that in many cases, these leftist movements were more about national liberation and social justice than about aligning with the Soviet Union.
Right.
But the U.S., blinded by its Cold War ideology, seemed unable or unwilling to see those nuances.
It's like they were looking at the world through a very narrow lens, painting everything with the same brush, and justifying their interventions as a fight against communism, when in reality, other factors were often at play.
Exactly.
Right.
And those other factors, those hidden agendas and motivations, are what Blum's work encourages us to uncover and examine critically.
Okay, so we've talked about the early Cold War, the CIA's covert operations, and this recurring pattern of the U.S. intervening in Southeast Asia and Latin America to contain communism. Where do we go from here?
Let's delve deeper into specific cases.
Okay.
Examine the long-term consequences of these interventions and consider how they continue to shape the world we live in today.
Sounds good to me. Let's dive in.
Okay.
Okay, so we've been unpacking these U.S. interventions.
Right.
Detailed in William Blum's Killing Hope.
Yeah.
It's clear that the U.S. was incredibly active during the Cold War.
Yeah.
But it's not just about toppling governments or winning wars, is it?
You're right. It's not just about immediate outcomes.
Right.
The legacy of these interventions is complex and multifaceted.
Right.
We need to consider the long-term impacts on societies, economies, and even political systems.
Yeah.
The ripple effects can last for generations.
So it's not just about whether the U.S. achieved its immediate objectives,
Right.
but about the unintended consequences that unfolded over time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Take the example of Iran.
Okay.
The 1953 coup, orchestrated by the CIA to overthrow Mossadegh, had a profound impact on Iranian society.
Right.
It paved the way for the Shah's authoritarian rule, which ultimately led to the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
That's a really powerful example.
Yeah.
It almost seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
Right.
The U.S., fearing the spread of communism, intervenes in a country, destabilizes it, and then ends up facing a completely different and often more challenging threat later on.
That pattern repeats itself in other parts of the world as well.
Right.
And it's not just about political instability.
Right.
Blum also points out how these interventions often breed resentment and anti-American sentiment.
Right.
It's almost as if the U.S., by acting as this global policeman, ends up alienating the very people they claim to be helping.
Right. This perception of the U.S. as an imperial power, interfering in the affairs of sovereign nations, has deep roots in many parts of the world.
Yeah.
And these interventions, as Blum documents them, seem to reinforce that image.
Yeah, it certainly complicates the U.S.'s image on the global stage, wouldn't you say?
It does.
After all, the U.S. often presents itself as a champion of democracy and freedom.
It does seem like a bit of a disconnect, right?
Right.
Between the rhetoric and the reality of U.S. foreign policy.
Exactly. Yeah. And this disconnect has fueled a great deal of skepticism and mistrust towards the U.S. in many parts of the world.
Okay, so we're talking about this complex legacy of intervention and how it shapes global perceptions of the U.S.
Right.
Let's zoom in a bit.
Okay.
Blum dedicates a significant portion of his book to Latin America, where U.S. intervention has been particularly pervasive.
Right.
Why is Latin America such a focal point?
Latin America has often been viewed, rightly or wrongly, as the U.S.'s backyard.
Right.
A region where the U.S. has felt entitled to exert its influence and control.
Right.
And this has led to a long and troubled history of interventions, from covert operations to full-blown military invasions.
It seems like the U.S. has repeatedly viewed any leftist movement in Latin America as an inherent threat, regardless of their actual policies or intentions.
The domino theory, as we discussed earlier, was particularly potent in Latin America,
Right.
fueling the fear that any communist foothold would inevitably lead to the spread of Soviet influence throughout the entire region.
And that fear often led to some truly disastrous consequences,
Right.
as we saw in countries like Chile, Guatemala, and Nicaragua.
The legacy of U.S. intervention in Latin America is something that continues to this day.
Right.
Many countries in the region are still struggling with political instability, economic inequality, and the lingering effects of U.S.-backed dictatorships.
Yeah.
It's a complex and often tragic legacy that is important for us to try to understand.
Absolutely. And it's not just about the past, is it?
No.
The U.S. continues to exert its influence in Latin America today, often through economic policies and trade agreements that some argue favor U.S. corporations and undermine local economies.
You raise a valid point.
Yeah.
It's almost as if the intervention has taken on a different form,
Right.
a more subtle and nuanced approach, but the underlying goal of maintaining U.S. hegemony in the region persists.
Blum also sheds light on U.S. interventions in Southeast Asia,
Okay.
a region deeply scarred by the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War was a watershed moment in U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
It fueled a sense of caution and a reluctance to commit ground troops to foreign conflicts.
Right.
But that didn't mean the U.S. stopped intervening altogether.
Right. Blum talks about how the U.S., even after their defeat in Vietnam, continued to intervene in countries like Cambodia and Laos,
Right.
supporting regimes and engaging in covert actions that ultimately destabilized the region.
They may have learned some lessons from Vietnam, but they shifted their tactics,
Right.
relying more on covert operations, air power, and support for proxy forces, rather than large-scale ground deployments.
But these interventions, even without boots on the ground, still had a significant impact, didn't they?
Absolutely, as Blum points out.
Yeah.
These interventions often created more instability-fueled existing conflicts and left behind a legacy of resentment and anti-American sentiment.
Blum then turns his attention to Africa.
Okay.
The continent often overlooked in discussions of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
What insights does he offer about U.S. involvement in Africa?
He highlights the role of economic interests,
Okay.
particularly access to natural resources as a key driver of U.S. intervention in countries like Zaire and Angola.
That's interesting. Africa, with its vast reserves of oil, minerals, and other strategic resources, has long been a target of Western economic exploitation.
And the U.S. seeking to maintain its global dominance and secure access to those resources has often intervened in African countries to prevent the rise of any rivals or challenges to its interests.
Blum specifically talks about how the U.S. supported Mobutu in Zaire.
Right.
Despite his brutal dictatorship.
Right.
Because of Zaire's strategic importance and its vast mineral wealth.
And in Angola, the U.S. backed anti-communist factions in the Civil War.
Okay.
Largely because they saw the Soviet-backed MPLA as a threat to U.S. economic interests in the region.
So it's not always just about ideology, is it?
Right.
Economic interests often play a significant role in shaping U.S. foreign policy, especially in resource-rich regions like Africa.
Blum's account of U.S. interventions in Africa is a sobering reminder of how the pursuit of economic dominance can often lead to the U.S. supporting corrupt and repressive regimes,
right,
sometimes with devastating consequences for the people in those countries.
Blum's book isn't just about specific countries or regions, is it?
No.
He also examines the tactics and methods used by the U.S. in these interventions.
Yes, and one of the most striking revelations is the extent of the CIA's covert operations during this period.
Wow.
Blum exposes this vast web of propaganda,
right,
sabotage, election meddling, and even assassination plots.
It's a chilling reminder that there's often a hidden history behind U.S. foreign policy actions.
Right.
It's like a whole other world operating in the shadows,
right,
a side of U.S. foreign policy that's often shrouded in secrecy and deniability.
Exactly. The CIA during the Cold War
right,
was given an extraordinary amount of power and autonomy to conduct these covert operations, often acting with very little oversight or accountability.
Blum does a remarkable job of bringing some of these shadowy activities to light.
Yeah.
He's shedding light on how the U.S. sought to manipulate events and shape outcomes around the world.
Yeah.
Often without the knowledge or consent of the American people.
He discusses how the CIA infiltrated labor unions, funded opposition groups, spread disinformation through various channels, and even orchestrated coups to install regimes that were more favorable to U.S. interests.
It's a disturbing reminder that the U.S., in its pursuit of global dominance, was often willing to use some pretty ruthless methods to achieve its objectives.
Blum's account of the CIA's covert operations really underscores the importance of transparency and accountability in foreign policy, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and it's not just about covert operations.
Right.
He also highlights the role of propaganda and information warfare in shaping narratives and influencing public opinion, both domestically and internationally.
You're right. The U.S. has often used its vast media and cultural influence to try to shape perceptions and advance its foreign policy goals.
It's almost as if they understand the power of narrative, of controlling the story and influencing how people view events.
Precisely. Blum discusses how the U.S., through organizations like the United States Information Agency, engaged in extensive propaganda campaigns, spreading pro-U.S. messages and discrediting those they perceived as opponents.
He also talks about how the CIA planted stories in foreign media, manipulated journalists, and even created front organizations to spread disinformation and shape public opinion. Yeah. It makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It does.
How much of what we see and hear is actually objective truth?
Right.
And how much of it is shaped by hidden agendas and powerful interests seeking to manipulate public perception?
It really highlights the importance of critical thinking.
Yes.
Of seeking out diverse perspectives.
Yes.
And being aware of the potential for manipulation in the media.
You are absolutely right.
Yeah.
We need to be discerning consumers of information, able to separate fact from fiction, and challenge the narratives being presented to us.
Yeah.
That's one of the key takeaways from Blum's work.
Right.
It's not just about understanding history.
Right.
It's about developing the critical thinking skills needed to navigate a world saturated with information.
We've talked about covert operations, propaganda, and information warfare.
Right.
What about the role of economic power in these interventions?
That's another crucial aspect of Blum's analysis.
Okay.
The U.S. is the world's leading economic power.
Right. Has often used its financial leverage to pressure countries into aligning with its foreign policy goals.
So it's not always about direct military intervention.
Right.
Sometimes it's about using economic tools like aid,
Yeah.
trade agreements, and even sanctions as a form of coercion.
Precisely. Blum discusses how the U.S. has used economic pressure to punish countries that defy its dictates,
Right.
to reward those that cooperate,
Right.
and to shape the global economic order in ways that are beneficial to its own interests.
He specifically mentions how the U.S. has exerted its influence in international financial institutions, like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to advance its interests.
Right.
And in some cases, impose its economic model on other countries.
It's a reminder that economic power and political power are often intertwined.
Right.
And the U.S. has frequently used its economic dominance to achieve its foreign policy objectives.
Yeah.
Blum is encouraging us to look beyond the surface and examine these often hidden levers of power.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about covert operations,
Right.
propaganda, economic coercion,
Right.
and the lasting impacts of these interventions.
Yeah.
What's the overarching message here?
Right.
What is Blum ultimately trying to convey?
Blum's book is a powerful indictment of U.S. foreign policy,
Right.
but it's also a call for greater awareness and engagement.
Okay.
He wants us to understand these interventions, to learn from the past, and to hold our leaders accountable for their actions.
He's reminding us that foreign policy isn't just something that happens in distant lands.
Right.
It affects us all, both at home and abroad.
Exactly.
Our choices have consequences.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility as informed citizens to understand those choices and their impact on the world.
That's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive, isn't it?
It is.
Blum's book isn't just a historical account. It's a call for critical thinking, for questioning assumptions, and for understanding the often hidden forces that shape global events.
It's a lot to process, but I think it's essential for us to grapple with these uncomfortable truths if we want to create a more just and peaceful world.
And that leads us to some crucial questions.
Okay.
How have these interventions shaped the world we live in today?
Yeah.
What are the lasting legacies of U.S. foreign policy?
Right.
And perhaps most importantly, what lessons can we learn from these interventions and apply to our understanding of current events?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And I think they're essential for us to grapple with if we want to create a more just and peaceful world.
And those are precisely the questions we'll continue to explore in the next part of our deep dive.
So we've spent this deep dive exploring the history of U.S. interventionism guided by William Blum's Killing Hope.
Right.
It's a lot to take in, all these actions, motivations, and the ripple effects.
Yeah.
Now the question becomes, how do we apply these lessons to the world today?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've inherited this complex legacy, and it's still shaping global dynamics.
Blum seems to suggest that one of the biggest takeaways is understanding the limits of U.S. power.
Absolutely.
Is that what you took away from it as well?
The U.S. has immense power.
Right.
Military, economic, and cultural. But it's not limitless.
Right.
And trying to force its will on the world often backfires, creating more resistance and instability.
Right.
Sometimes the best course of action is restraint.
It's about recognizing that the U.S. can't control everything that happens in the world.
Right.
And that attempting to impose its will often leads to unintended consequences.
Exactly. Blum's book is full of examples of the U.S. trying to force countries to adopt its model.
Right.
Its ideology, its way of doing things. And those efforts often have the opposite effect of what was intended.
So what's the alternative?
Yeah.
If the U.S. can't or shouldn't try to control everything, what's its role in the world?
Right.
How should it engage with other nations?
Blum advocates for a more humble, less interventionist approach. One that recognizes the sovereignty of other nations and respects their right to choose their own path.
Yeah.
It's about shifting from a mindset of control to one of partnership and collaboration.
So instead of dictating terms, it's about listening to and working with other countries on an equal footing.
Precisely. It's about building genuine partnerships,
Okay.
working through international organizations, and seeking peaceful resolutions to conflict.
He also emphasizes the importance of diplomacy and multilateralism, right?
Absolutely. Diplomacy should be the first, not the last resort.
Right.
It's about building coalitions, working through international institutions like the United Nations, and engaging in good faith negotiations.
It's about recognizing that lasting solutions come from cooperation and understanding not from imposing your will on others.
Exactly. It's about building trust, fostering cooperation, and creating a more stable and predictable world order.
Right.
That benefits everyone, including the U.S.
This might seem idealistic to some. Doesn't this approach require the U.S. to give up some of its power, some of its dominance on the world stage?
Perhaps, but true power doesn't always come from dominance.
Right.
It can come from leadership,
Yeah.
from inspiring others, from setting a positive example that others want to emulate.
Right.
Think about it.
Yeah.
Don't you respect someone more who leads by example than someone who forces you to do things their way?
That's a powerful point. It's about the difference between coercion and inspiration.
Right.
And that kind of leadership, one that inspires rather than dictates, is more likely to create a world that's both more stable and more just.
Blum also reminds us that a more ethical foreign policy is essential.
Okay.
He challenges us to consider the moral implications of our actions, to think about the human cost of intervention.
Right.
And to strive for a foreign policy that is grounded in principles of peace, justice, and human rights.
It's about aligning our actions with our values, right?
Yes.
Asking ourselves, are we truly living up to the ideals we claim to champion?
And recognizing that peace and security are interconnected.
Right.
We can't build a truly just and peaceful world by ignoring injustice and violence elsewhere.
Right.
What impacts one part of the world inevitably impacts us all in some way.
This all raises a question that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah.
What can we as ordinary citizens actually do about this?
Yeah.
How can we have a meaningful impact on foreign policy when it often feels so distant and controlled by powerful forces beyond our reach?
That sense of powerlessness is understandable.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that we're not powerless.
Okay.
Blum argues that we all have a role to play.
Right.
We can educate ourselves about these issues.
Uh-huh.
We can engage in public discourse and debate.
Right.
We can hold our elected leaders accountable for their decisions, and we can support organizations working for peace and justice.
So it's not just about changing specific policies.
Yeah.
It's about shifting the entire mindset that drives those policies in the first place.
Exactly. It's about creating a society that prioritizes peace over war diplomacy, over military force, and cooperation over domination.
Right.
It's a long-term project for sure, but it starts with each one of us.
Blum's book, while focused on historical events, provides a framework for thinking about contemporary issues and how we engage with the world around us.
Absolutely.
It's a call to action, a challenge for each of us to become more informed, more engaged, and more committed to creating a more just and peaceful world.
If you take one thing away from this deep dive, let it be this.
Yeah.
You have a voice, and your actions, no matter how small they may seem, can contribute to a better future.
That's a good takeaway.
Never underestimate the power of informed citizens working together for positive change.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Killing Hope is a dense and challenging book, but it raises crucial questions about the role of the U.S. in the world.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about in textbooks. It's a living force that continues to shape our present and our future. We hope this deep dive has provided you with some new insights into U.S. foreign policy, and maybe it sparked some new questions for you to explore further.
It's been a pleasure diving deep with you today.
Likewise.
Remember, critical thinking and a willingness to challenge assumptions are essential tools for navigating the complexities of our world.
Couldn't agree more.
Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving for a better future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.